Good morning. Today is the 24th of Tammuz, the 13th of July, and we are up to the fifth reading of Matot-Massei. And now we're deep into Massei. Massei literally means the journeys. So we've already read the 42 journeys yesterday, even though we didn't talk about that. So there were 42 journeys that they took from Egypt all the way to the land of Canaan, to the land of Israel. And we didn't connect this yesterday. We'll try to connect it today, how this is related to the topic we talked about yesterday, which was mostly about the 50th gate. I mean, so right away you already see that there's at least some connection between 42 and 50, and we'll see in a moment where that goes. In today's reading starts off with the commandment to completely destroy all idolatry in the land of Canaan. This apparently never happened. For whatever reason, the Canaanites continued to live together with the Israelites in the land. And they sort of, I'm not sure what exactly when and how it happened, but they slowly died out. And there was never any great battles or anything like that. There was never an eradication. There was a constant, connection between the Israelites and the Canaanites, and because of that, there was a lot of idol worship actually between the Israelites. So that's the first commandment in today's portion. After that, we are told about the borders of the land of Israel. And there's a lot discussed about these borders because they seem to be quite specific, naming particular places, and it starts from the south and goes all the way around the land. So we have this interesting description. We don't have another description like this anywhere. But what we want to talk about today is that the land of Israel has constantly always been shrinking and growing. It's not an easy land to describe. When Abraham, in the covenant between the shards, when he was promised the land, God promised him, I don't know if you've ever seen these maps, but there's a map that starts from Egypt basically and runs all the way to the Euphrates. So we're talking about all the land that includes what today is Jordan and Syria and most of Iraq. And that's what God promised Abraham. Here, the area is much smaller. Again, there's all kinds of different interpretations about this, but pretty much, I don't know if you can see this, but here, it's pretty much the same size as what modern Israel is today, minus some areas of Lebanon, and maybe a little bit of the Sinai, which is also included in these borders. When the Israelites entered the land, they never conquered this amount of territory. In theory, they did, but in practice, like we said, the Canaanites remained, and in fact, they never really did conquer the entire area. The closest that they came was in the time of David. There's a very beautiful allusion here that there are exactly 196 letters in the description of these borders, and 196, I believe it can't be the letters, it's got to be the words. There's 196 words, and 196 is a square of 14. We talked about 14 yesterday, so we have here another instance of 14. The 14th letter is Nun, the letter that's equal to 50, and the one that describes Moses. And 14, as we said yesterday, I think we mentioned this also, is equal to David. So we have here David squared words describing the land, and it appears to be that David was the one who conquered the most and came closest to these borders in and of themselves. Another beautiful thing is that 196 is equal to before God, Lifnei Havaya. And this is a phrase that's used a number of times in describing David as he dances before God. He has this simple idea that he's always facing God. He's never turning his head from God. What does that mean? That usually people, after they do something wrong, so they imagine, and this is very common, not just with God, this is very common with other people as well, they imagine that the other person must be so angry at me, God must be so angry at me, so he's not looking at me anymore. He doesn't want to talk to me. He doesn't want to show me his face. But the truth is that can happen with people, but it can't happen with God. And that's the most important teaching that David taught us. And that's why he's called the sages call him the one who taught us how to do tshuva. He's the master of tshuva, the master of returning to God. Because to return to God, you have to at least assume that God wants you back. And so what he actually taught us is that God is always facing you. There's no such thing as God is turning away from you. And it's very common in the world to think the opposite, that somehow God is not facing you, somehow he's not interested in you anymore. And that was the great rectification that came from King David, that even though he sinned, he taught us how to do tshuva, and tshuva, again, is predicated on this idea that God is always waiting for me to return. Years later, this entered into our liturgy on Yom Kippur, that we say that, based on some verses, that even until the day of one's death, God is still waiting for him to come back, to return to God. The idea that's related here to the land of Israel is, of course, that in the land of Israel, this is much more prominent. It's felt a lot stronger. Meaning, we say that there's a verse in Deuteronomy that we'll see hopefully in the next few weeks. The eyes of Havaya, your God, are in it, meaning in the land, from the beginning of the year till the end of the year. So there's this constant feeling that there's divine providence, but more importantly, that God is looking at you all the time, waiting for you to make the move, waiting for you to do something. With that in mind, and with a little bit of background that we gave, it's very important to know that there are 5 different descriptions of the borders of the land of Israel. The smallest amount of borders were the borders of the Second Temple period. Those were the smallest in terms of area. The next largest were what the Israelites who came out of Egypt conquered. Like we said, it was less than what the borders here are describing. So we have, again, the borders of those who came back from the Babylonian captivity, the Second Temple period, the First Temple period, which is what they conquered in practice, what we have in our Parsha, in Massei, in our reading today, which is bigger than what they actually conquered. Above that, we have the borders described to Abraham, which were, as we mentioned, a lot bigger. And then finally, what the sages say, that the land of Israel is destined to expand over the entire world. So that's as big as you can get. It contains the entire globe. What are we talking about? We're talking about where holiness resides and how holiness resides. And so, really, there's a lot of explanation that we can say about each one of them. I want to talk mostly about the two first ones we just described. We had altogether 5. We haven't done this in these classes yet, or these little get-togethers, but every time we have something that has 5 parts to it, so we like to correspond it to the letters of God's essential name, Havaya, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Tetragrammaton, plus the tip of the Yud. So going from the bottom, the borders of the land of Israel in the Second Temple period is the Hay, the last Hay, what we call the kingdom. The borders of the First Temple period are the Vav, the second to last letter. What's the difference between the two? And how does this relate to today's borders in our Parsha, which is the Hay, the higher Hay? So the higher Hay, today's reading and the description of the theoretical borders that they were supposed to conquer, that hay is always bina, it's always understanding, and it's always related to thought. So there was the thought, there was the theory that this would be the size of the land. In practice, when it came down to actually conquering it, it was much less, and that relates to the Vav, like we said, the borders of the land of Israel during the time of the first temple. Why didn't they conquer everything? Why weren't they able to? The explanation is that despite all that they had learned, still the overriding principle was me and my strength. It was all about ego in the end. And so when you work with ego, there's only so much that you can conquer. So even though they had all the ability to do it, they weren't able to complete that. They weren't able to come to the 50th gate that we mentioned yesterday. He said to be in the 50th gate, you have to start from seeing yourself allegorically as a leper, seeing yourself as someone who doesn't have anything and needs everything from God. That's what we saw yesterday. So they needed to come to the 50th gate, but they weren't able to because there was something holding them back, and what was holding them back was their ego. On the other hand, when the Jewish people came back from Babylon, from the Babylonian exile, they were at their weakest state ever. Now there's a very interesting thing. They conquered much less. They couldn't hold on to very little. In fact, they didn't conquer. They weren't able to keep an army. They weren't able to do any of that. All we know about the Second Temple period is that they settled the land, but they never had a real army. The Hasmoneans had an army for a while, and the rebellion against the Romans was something of an army. But really, there was no conquering going on. It was just settling, and wherever you were able to hold on to the land, that's what was the borders. What is the difference between that and why was it so little? Because they didn't have the power. But halachically, legally, there's a very interesting principle that the lands that they held on to in the Second Temple period are considered to be sacred till this day. But the lands that were conquered in the First Temple period, the sacredness that they had, the sanctity that they had, was gone once the first exile, once the Babylonian exile started. And again, that was because even though it was sanctified at the time, because it came out of a feeling of self, out of a feeling of ego, out of a feeling of personal strength, that eventually diminishes. And even God says about the first temple that was built, even though it was supposed to be a temple for God, there was a lot of aspects of it that Solomon did it to aggrandize himself. And so God says, I have hated this building from the moment that it was built. He says that about the first temple in one of the later prophecies. So that sanctity wasn't able to stick, and it was canceled. And the sanctity that we have today, what we consider to be sacred today, is only from the Second Temple period. Again, this is halachically, legally. Wherever Jews settled in the Second Temple period, we are bound to perform the commandments, that the agricultural commandments that belong to those areas, only according to the pale of settlement in the Second Temple. Why? Because even though they were weaker, even though they held on to a lot less, they came from a place of lowliness. They came from a place that everything that we're able to achieve is because of God. And that sanctity, say the sages, kitcha l'sha'ata v'kitcha la'atid lavo, that sanctity was in their time, and it holds until today.